Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Nicole Cromarty, and I'm the Director of Education and Programs at the Clyfford Still Museum. Tonight, we are so excited to have Janet Bishop, the Thomas Weisel Family Chief Curator and Curator of Painting and Sculpture at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. She'll be joining us tonight from her office in San Francisco. Throughout the run of our current exhibition, Stories We Tell, the collection Two Ways, we're inviting curators who have worked with Clyfford Still's art at some point in their careers to share their perspectives. The San Francisco Museum of Modern Art currently holds 30 works by Clyfford Still in their collection. As Chief Curator and Curator of Paintings and Sculpture at SFMoMA, a position Janet assumed in 2019, she oversees a division of 30 curatorial staff members and represents the museum's program as a part of SFMoMA's executive team. Some highlights of Janet's curatorial career include a recent David Park retrospective in 2020, Matisse Diebenkorn 2016-2017, co-organized with the Baltimore Museum of Art, and the Steins Collect, Matisse, Picasso, and the Parisian Avant-Garde, which traveled to the Grand Palais and Palace and the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Much of her work has focused on the art and artists within her immediate community, from SFMoMA's current Bay Area Wall series to the SECA Art Award exhibitions. She is currently at work on a retrospective of the work of Joan Brown. Tonight, Janet will be speaking about her perspectives on PH 71, which was painted in 1948. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us, Janet.
Thank you, Nicole. It is such a pleasure to be with you all this evening. SFMoMA, as you just heard, has a very long connection to Clyfford Still. And of the 30 paintings in the collection, one was a gift of the art dealer, Peggy Guggenheim, in 1947. One was a gift of collectors Hunk and Moo Anderson in 1974. And then 28 paintings came to us directly from the artist in 1975. And with this gift of the artist, the museum committed to a permanent monographic gallery devoted to a rotating presentation of Still's paintings. So Still is one of the artists whose work is always on view at SFMoMA. And the gallery is not always in the same place in the building. For many years, it lived within our historic collection presentation on the second floor, adjacent to a gallery by other artists associated with abstract expressionism. And now it's actually up on the fourth floor as part of a suite of monographic galleries. So there's surprises for people every time they come, and new ways to see Clyfford Still at SFMoMA. So I don't know Denver well, but have happily visited the gorgeous Clyfford Still Museum on 2 occasions. The first was in 2015 when I was invited to participate in a conservation summit about Still's painting, along with our paintings conservator. And then I visited a second time that same year with our design and education teams. It was a moment when we were planning for our new building, our expansion, which opened in May of 2016. And we were looking to peer institutions for models. My colleagues and I absolutely loved, in particular, the interactive timeline at the Clyfford Still Museum, and ended up contracting with the same company for our project. So in any case, it's wonderful to be back, if you will, even virtually. And I love the opening slide sequence, Nicole, which was a sort of wander through your galleries. It made me feel as though I'm certainly overdue for a return visit. So in thinking about which painting by Still to select for one painting at a time, which is such a great concept for a program stream, I decided on PH 71. A squarish painting that measures about 5 feet high and about 4 feet wide, and is dominated, as you can see, by the color yellow, with patches of white and red at the side. It looks like there might be some lavender in there. It was made in San Francisco during the artist's tenure as professor at the California School of Fine Arts. And since one of the upsides of doing this over Zoom is that we have the option of bringing in comparative images. I thought it might be interesting to consider this painting in relationship to the work of David Park, who is a contemporary of Still's and rival, if you will, who served on the California School of Fine Arts faculty at the same time as Still. And he's best known for his pioneering role in the development of Bay Area figurative art. And as Nicole mentioned, SFMoMA recently presented a retrospective of his work. It was open during the brief window within the pandemic that our museum was open in October and November of 2020. So here are photographic portraits of the two featured artists. Still, who grew up in Alberta, Canada, and went to school in Washington State. He first got to the Bay Area in 1943, and after short stints in Virginia and in New York, he accepted a teaching position in San Francisco and began his tenure at the school, the California School of Fine Arts, in the fall of 1946. And while there are differing views as to the extent of Still's impact on local painters, he was certainly a powerful personality who fueled interest in non-objective painting, which would become the dominant mode of expression among post-war avant-garde painters on both coasts. With Still being really the de facto leader, abstract expressionism just flourished at the school and really dominated local exhibitions from the late 1940s and well into the 1950s. Park was a native of Boston and 6 years younger than Still. He was already on the faculty when Still arrived. He had become a full-time instructor there in 1945. And Park, like Still, was brought on by the director, Douglas McKagy. And he at the time was very restless in terms of a stylistic direction. He hadn't settled into his mature style of figuration. He was almost entirely self-taught without either a high school or college degree, but he really excelled as a teacher and Still stayed on until 1950 and Park until 1951. So for 4 years, their teaching careers overlapped. And the two were oil and water. Still joined the faculty and was resentful that McKagy gave Park the coveted advanced painting class. Park resisted Still's grand persona and strict ideologies. Park once said, "I do not believe in imposing rules upon students," really in direct reference to Still. And apparently their dislike for each other even once got physical. I read that in Nancy Boas's wonderful biography of David Park. So though Park and Still were very definitely not friends, they were certainly tracking one another's work. Maybe we can move to the next slide, Allison. So what was Park doing in 1948? I chose that PH 71 from 1948. And here we see Still's painting along with a work called Untitled J, which is a really rare surviving example of Park's abstract expressionist work from the same year. Still's work on the left is not known to have been publicly shown, but thanks to the amazing research of the Clyfford Still Museum staff, I recently learned that it was displayed for others to see in Still's studio at the school. So it's very likely that Park would have seen this particular canvas. It's fascinating to me to see both the differences in approach as well as the resonances. By this point in Still's career, he was a deeply committed abstractionist. And the rectilinear expanses of color in Park's work, on the other hand, seem to connect in some way to the real world. I don't know whether Park was ever completely abstract. To my mind, he might be positioning us inside a tent in this canvas, or maybe in front of a music stand. The relationship between the color palettes is quite clear, with each dominated by a hue in the family of yellows, along with accents of white and some form of red. What I'll draw your eye to in Park's work is the left edge of his painting, the bolt of white And if you look, that runs down that left edge from the top and then stops, nearly all the way down at the bottom of the composition. And then if you look at closely at Still's painting, he does something similar with the edge of this work on the right-hand side of his painting. And maybe when we get to the end and we do a close-up of pH 71, we can look at that long, skinny passage at the right edge of Still's composition. So Park had really high regard for the abstract work of others. He stated that he said, "I believe the best painting America has produced is in the current non-objective direction." And he said that in the early 1950s, but he never found his own work in this style to be authentic. He had some success with it, and in just one example, Untitled J was shown at SFMoMA in 1948, excuse me, so the year it was made. We were then called the San Francisco Museum of Art. It was in an exhibition along with the work of Elmer Bischoff and Hassel Smith, who were both friends and colleagues. And Park had about 15 canvases in that show. Interestingly, Park's canvases were all given letters, just as a way to differentiate one for the next, for record keeping purposes. Elmer Bischoff's were numbered, and then Hassel Smith's all had these very poetic titles. But Park, he later said that what his abstract or non-objective paintings told him was that he was a hardworking guy who was trying to be important. And so he called it quits. Sometime either in late 1949 or more likely early 1950, Park loaded his car up with as many paintings as he could fit in it and drove with his wife Lydia to an East Bay dump and discarded them. And it's interesting because this is not sort of consistent with Park's economic reality. He often scraped his paintings down or painted over them. He lived on a shoestring, and so to discard a whole cache of paintings meant that he really needed a completely fresh start. He needed to get them out of his studio and to do something new. "I do not want to be known by this work," he said, as he turned his attention from paintings to what he called pictures. Go to the next slide, please. And so, to the shock of his peers, this is what came next. This is a painting called Rehearsal from 1950, and is thought to be the first painting in Park's new figurative style. It was the first to be exhibited. It made its public debut at the California Palace of the Legion of Honor in Lincoln Park on the west end of San Francisco. That was in March of 1950. The subject here is the Studio 13 Jazz Band, which got its name from a studio space at the California School of Fine Arts, where a really shifting group of very convivial faculty members and students and other friends of people associated with the school would gather. And I love the painter Deborah Remington's way of describing the school's atmosphere at the time. She said, "Imagine the teachers who taught you also played in the band you danced to, and the director of the school was the drummer." So that's Douglas McKagy, the director, in the back on drums, wearing a red shirt. Elmer Bischoff is we see from the back with a blue shirt. He's on cornet. And though the piece looks at first glance like it's a total 180 from what Park had been doing, I think the compositional connections to Still, are still there. If you look at the lower edge, for instance, we see just a slice of Park's own head and ear as he sits at the piano. And the way Park presents John Schuler, who's on the stand-up bass on the right-hand side, so further speaks to my mind to Park's obsession with unexpected centers of interest, with slivers of figures at the edges whose shapes almost parody those of Still in some ways. Park's display of this piece went largely under the radar in terms of critical response. There really wasn't any, but his peers who did see it were totally perplexed. We might note that, that abstract painting was so deeply understood to be the only serious avant-garde style at the time that Park's peers just didn't know what to make of it. Frank Lobdell, his friend and colleague, wondered if rehearsal might have been made as a kind of souvenir. Park certainly had affection for the subject, that he might have wanted to capture that. But if not, he concluded that it had to be a gag, which is how he described it in a letter to Richard Dievenkorn, who was off in New Mexico at the time working on his MFA. You can switch to the next slide. Over the next couple of years, it became clear that Park wasn't kidding and he wasn't turning back. And in these new figurative paintings, he often focused on the vernacular. So people doing ordinary things, either individually or in groups, interiors, exteriors. This particular scene is very tender. It features the artist's own family at the table, having a meal. Park himself is again seen from the back. You'll see a little more of you see his full head this time, as well as his neck and shoulders and a hand. He interestingly really never did a straight up self-portrait. There's kind of a caricature portrait that he did of himself in the 1940s. It's sort of part of a kind of a series of mask-like paintings. But he really never turned his brush to depicting his face. So you see his older daughter, Natalie, is on the left. You see, again, the composition kind of cuts right through her face, and you just see her head resting in her hand with her elbow on the table. That's Park's wife, Lydia, at the back or at the top in blue. And then the chair on the right-hand side, the empty red chair, stands in for Park's younger daughter, Helen, who had recently left home. And when we were preparing the retrospective, we did X-ray photography of this painting, really wondering whether there might be an abstraction underneath, because the composition, it has some relationship to Untitled J, which we saw earlier. We did not find an abstract painting underneath, but we did find that Park shifted Lydia to the left while he was making the painting, and he widened the table over the course of completing the piece. That came across pretty clearly. So rehearsal, table with fruit, also demonstrates Park's obsessions with radical cropping and the edges of the canvas. He was also certainly looking at French painting as well as the work of his peers. The scene recalls the intimate interiors of Bonnard and Vuillard, for instance. Park never went to Europe, but he spent a lot of time looking at books and a lot of time, and whenever he had the opportunity to see exhibitions, either in San Francisco or in other places, he certainly took advantage. Go to the next slide. So bringing back PH 71 on the left, and then we have the bus on the right-hand side. So we talked a little bit about some of the compositional devices that interested both Clyfford Still and David Park. The decisions about where to put various passages of paint, to make for a satisfying canvas. And I thought we might also take a moment with this pairing or juxtaposition to focus on fields of color. Park often painted urban scenes. He was drawn to them. And here, I think we sort of step right into the Hopper-like emotional isolation of this woman who's standing in front of a bus. I don't think that this is likely to reference a particular individual. There are quite a number of paintings made around the same time where the faces look really similar. So I think it's a more generalized depiction. And we think that Park made this canvas in 1952. It was around the same time that he saw a presentation at SFMoMA of the large traveling retrospective that Alfred Barr organized for MoMA, New York. And many of Park's canvases from that time and directly afterwards feature an overall expansive color, such as what we see in the orange of the bus. May have been inspired by Matisse's use of such fields to unify the elements of his compositions. But it also really harkens back to the approach that Still took in PH 71 and other canvases that Park would have known. Both canvases are, of course, so much more than they are in reproduction. I love the subtle shifts in both color and texture and the layers of color that make up the final surfaces. Yellow into flatter, more opaque yellow in Still, and orange into a more kind of persimmon orange in Park. I love the flashes of light that we get, the white at the lower right corner in the Clyfford Still, and then the light coming through the windows of the bus in the upper portion of the David Park. Next slide, please. So, I really appreciate the chance to use, this opportunity to use PH 71 as a point of departure for a discussion about the paintings of both David Park and Clyfford Still. I'm really pleased that the sequence of opening slides that preceded this presentation included this canvas hanging on the walls at the Clifford Still Museum, so you can see it in the context of other work. I'm hoping in some way that considering Still's painting in relationship to these few examples of Parks from around the same time and from the years directly following, allows us to see both artists' work in new ways, and also to shine a spotlight on Still's enduring impact. As artists at the California School of Fine Arts, fell into two camps, the Still camp and the Park camp, both during their teaching tenures, during the time of their teaching tenures and beyond. I'm told that so too did the school's softball teams. There was an annual competition, as I understand it, with one team called the Creepy Crawlers. They were the Still followers, and the other called the Figs. They were the David Park people. And to me, it's a funny aside that's just emblematic of the culture of the school. So thank you.
Thanks for that, Janet. We can take questions now. So please feel free to drop those in the Q&A or in the chat. That's also fine. And we already have a few questions. Janet, if you're ready. The first question is a specific question about David Park's rehearsal. So if you wouldn't mind bringing that painting back up, it might be helpful just for everyone participating to see that as Janet is talking about it. We have someone in the chat who is interested in your take on whether their ear is bloody.
Oh, I don't think so.
Yeah.
I think it's the light. That's a great question, and I hadn't thought about that specifically. But there are so many paintings of Parks where the ear is red, and I think it's just the light, the way the light shined through it. But I love that question. While we're looking at this painting, another thing I'll just mention that I really find intriguing about it is what Richard Diebenkorn described as the long reach back. Like Park loved that really deep perspective where you've got that the extreme close up of his head and John Schuler on the right hand side, and then the other figures that are much smaller, much further back. And he loved. You can tell that he was entertaining himself as he came up with this composition in terms of the choices that he made.
I love that detail. Without that question, I don't even know that I would have noticed that. That's really interesting. Now we have a question sort of zooming back out. Were you interested in the relationship between Park and Still prior to this program? And if so, what sort of piqued your curiosity about the ties between these two artists?
Yes, I've been curious about it for a long time. It seems like, and it's a story that we've told at SFMoMA over many, many years. And there was an exhibition that I worked on with a former colleague, John Weber, who was our head of education at the time, and we looked at what was, we put Bay Area figurative art and abstract expressionism together, and really delved into that relationship. And it's a rivalry that is kind of legendary in San Francisco. So people who are aware of the history of art in this region will know something about. We'll know something about both artists. What was really interesting to me about the invitation to participate in this program was the assignment to just pick one painting. And I'd say that, I wanted to choose a painting that was from a moment when Still and Park knew each other, when they were both actively working, in the same place at the same time. And then I was also just interested in choosing a work of art where you can see the connections. I think the painting is more subtle than a lot of Still's works. So it's not a kind of spectacular painting. It's not a high drama painting. And I really wish I could see it in person. I may have seen it when I visited in 2015, but I'd really love to see it again because I'm so curious about the surface. Their paint handling was really different.
Well, you're welcome to come anytime. I just wanted to send a reminder. I think we have a couple hands raised, but if you want to just drop your question into the chat or into the Q&A, I can share that with Janet. We do have a few more questions right now. So in our Q&A, we have someone who says, one of the things that I love about this program is the opportunity, as you said, to just focus on one work of art. As a curator, do you feel like you get the opportunity to spend a lot of time with individual works of art in SFMoMA's collection?
I was our paintings conservator who I mentioned. I traveled to the Clifford Still Museum with Paula DiCristofaro. She was just in my office and we were chatting a little bit earlier, and we've both been at the museum for a long time, and we were talking about how lucky we are to have relationships with these paintings, the paintings in our collection, that we're both super attached to a lot of them. And so I guess the thing that as a curator, it's an incredible gift that I'm always learning, and that I have access to these pieces. During the earlier months of the pandemic, I would come down to the museum from time to time, and in part just to sort of check in on things, even though we were shuttered, and to see the paintings. So yes, I do have relationships with particular works of art.
All right, a couple more questions. So it's so interesting to me that the abstract artist of this pair was interested in rules and the figurative artist resisted them. This seems to run counter to many assumptions about these styles. I wonder if Janet has any thoughts on that.
Interesting. I know a lot more about Park than I do about Still. But I can just I'm also thinking of some of the approaches of not just these two artists, but their friends and their peers and people they admired. So David Park's closest friend was Richard Diebenkorn, and Diebenkorn, was really doing, he was making these very kind of robust canvases, the Berkeley series in the 1950s, and then started doing drawings with David Park, drawing from the model, and then eventually he shifted and started painting painting figuratively as well. And by 1955, there was a real Bay Area figurative art movement. But one thing I remember Richard Dievenkorn saying was that he felt like canvases needed to be responsibly covered. Like you don't see a whole lot of raw canvas in his work. And I thought that was really interesting, and just something that, and so one thing that fascinates me are the rules that artists set for themselves, like the parameters that they set for themselves, what feels okay to them and what doesn't. And that's that's as interesting to me as the kinds of rules that they might or might not impose on students.
So appealing to your knowledge about David Park, I have another question about David Park, and they're wondering if Park ever said how he felt about portraits. Very interesting that he doesn't show his face in his paintings.
Yeah, he did commission portraits. It wasn't his favorite thing to do. He did take commissions, not he didn't do a whole lot of them, but had a steady stream of them for a while when he really, it was just to supplement his his income. But he did, there were particular people who inspired him that he painted again and again. One was his wife, Lydia. She had dark hair and very short, kind of cropped bangs. And so she's recognizable in his work from the mid 1930s, kind of all the way until his very untimely death at the age of 49 in 1960. He did portraits of his friends too. He did portraits of Hassel Smith, Elmer Bischoff, Richard Dievenkorn. One thing that he said that was super funny to me is that he felt like all faces fell into the category of either birds, peaches, or horses, and that Richard Dievenkorn was a bird, Elmer Bischoff was a peach, and he himself was a horse. I thought this hilarious.
I love that. I'm gonna think about that the next time I look at portraits. Bird, peaches, and horses. Got it.
Yes. And I might add, Nicole, that that he also said that he really rarely painted his daughters. And he said that they were just too young and beautiful, and he really preferred like older faces, faces with wrinkles and lines and creases, and he preferred faces that were more weathered. And so Natalie and Helen. Helen doesn't appear in any paintings. He did one wedding portrait for Natalie and her husband Fred, but it was that was about it.
That's so interesting. And then I think we'll close with, if anybody wants to jump in, for those maybe contemplating a trip to the Bay Area, what's on at SFMoMA? What should they look for?
Come to the Bay Area. We're so happy to be open again. I think I mentioned that the David Park Show just ran for a brief period of time when we were open during 2020 in October and November. So it had a short run, but an appreciative audience. That has now been dispersed, but we are gaining in attendance, and the energy in the museum is really great right now. There is a lot on view. Our main kind of headliner exhibition is a retrospective of the work of Nam June Paik, which opened at the Tate and then went to the Stedelijk Museum and opened at SFMoMA in May. And that runs into the early fall, I think until late September, if I have that correctly. And there are many other things to see right now. There's a fascinating photography exhibition of the work of Deanna Markosian, a whole series of projects. You mentioned this one in the intro, Nicole, of wall paintings. They're commissions by local artists that were painted directly on the walls and kind of responsive to the conditions of 2020, and lots of other things too. So
that's great.
Including a gallery of Clyfford Still.
There you go. What more could you want? Well, thank you so much, Janet. It's always so interesting to see how people interpret this one painting at a time. And I don't know that I've seen one where it's been a one-to-one comparison with another artist. So that was a really interesting perspective to have. And I just got a comment in our feed from one of our members who comes to all of our programs. She says it's the highlight of her week, and thanks you for the fabulous discussion of Clyfford Still's work. This was really fun.
A pleasure. Thank you. I appreciate the invitation, and nice to be with a group of Clifford Still people.
Yes, I know.
On my screen.
Be in person at some time soon. So
that'd be great.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And thank you always to the SCFD for supporting programs like this, to our staff behind the scenes, making these programs possible. And thank you to all of our participants for being here tonight and for your great questions, as always.